Hi everyone. This week we begin our study of psychological and behavioral theories at the beginning with Freudian psychology. Sigmund Freud developed his ideas in the late 1800s and early part of the 20th century when the medical profession was developing interest in the study and treatment of so-called nervous conditions such as hysteria. In this painting, Charcot demonstrates the use of hypnosis with a female patient. Like Freud, Charcot was a neurologist. What do you notice in this picture? Sigmund Freud is the father of psychodynamic theory and psychoanalysis. Psycho comes from the Greek word psyche, meaning mind, and dynamic refers to processes or mechanisms. So psychodynamic theory refers to the workings of the mind. A main idea in this theory is that psychic or mental energy is limited, that is finite, and contained. Freud was fond of mechanical analogies. He thought that mental energy flows through the mind like water through plumbing pipes. Energy comes with thinking and feeling. Mental energy can get stuck, trapped, or fixated on something when we cannot solve a problem. For example, childhood sex abuse presents issues that cannot be solved by child victims. Children may not be able to make sense of the situation, may be afraid to express feelings, and lack control over their circumstances. Problems that cannot be resolved in childhood can lead to the misdirection of psychic energy. Feelings such as fear, anger, and sadness might be directed inward or towards safer targets instead of expressed directly. In a closed system, the energy associated with these feelings has to go somewhere. It cannot just dissipate. The psychic energy that is stuck can be expressed in symbols or symptoms. Thus, anger turned inward can lead to depression. In this theory, symptoms are seen as symbols of internal conflicts, unconscious wishes, and desires. Freud's drive theory suggests that we are born with certain instinctual id impulses. Freud thought that sex and aggression were the main id impulses. The term psychic determinism means that all behavior can be explained by internal mental forces or psychic energy. All thinking, feelings, speech, and actions are thought to be driven by psychic energy. Thus, there are no mistakes. Even slips of the tongue are produced by psychic energy. Freud described two types of thinking, primary and secondary processes. Another major contribution of Freud is the topographical model, which suggests that we have levels of awareness or consciousness. Like an iceberg, we are only conscious of a small portion of the mental energy and content, thoughts and feelings, that are available to us. There is a realm called the preconscious, which contains material that is not in our current awareness, but can be brought to mind fairly easily. Freud thought that most of what we think and feel exists in the unconscious portion of the mind. We do not have direct access to this material, but it affects us. Freud and others believe that material that is too threatening or uncomfortable for us is often stored in the unconscious part of the mind. In this way, our minds protect us from things we cannot understand, resolve, or cope with. This idea that much of experience is stored in an unconscious part of the mind is widely accepted. Freud also developed the theory that the mind has different structures in addition to realms of consciousness. These agencies or structures have different functions. The id is the seat of our impulses and drives. It operates on the pleasure principle, which wants immediate gratification of our desires. Id impulses are present at birth. The superego is the seat of our conscience, or ideas about morality, about right and wrong. This is not present at birth, but develops as a product of socialization, as parents and others teach children ideas about what is right and wrong. In Freudian theory, the ego develops over time to mediate conflicts between the id and superego. This conflict is ongoing. Next week, we will see that the ego psychologists place the ego at the center of this triad. Sigmund Freud thought the ego was relatively powerless compared to the id and superego. Don't confuse the structural theory, that is the idea that there are three agencies of the mind, the id, ego, and superego, with the topographical model. Both models are divided into three sections, but they do not map onto each other. It is not correct to say that the id is unconscious and the superego is conscious. There are aspects of the id, such as sexuality, that are conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. Similarly, there are aspects of the superego that fall into all three topographical levels. For example, we may have a lot of unconscious ideas about what makes a so-called good girl or a good boy or a good mother. These are in addition to the ideas that are in our awareness. Freud thought that development proceeded through a series of stages. He called these psychosexual stages, referring to the development of the mind and sexuality. The model is epigenetic, meaning that it is thought to unfold according to a predetermined plan. According to Freud, the stages must unfold in this order. People have to complete one stage before going on to the next. There is no stage skipping or reversal to a previous stage. The main idea is that at each stage, psychic energy is expressed primarily through one body part called an erogenous zone. In infancy, the erogenous zone is the mouth. Pleasure and aggression are expressed orally through sucking, biting, and crying, for example. If development is frustrated at this stage, meaning that the child's oral needs are not met, the child could develop an oral fixation. A fixation was thought to lead to symptoms, such as smoking or overeating, in adulthood. The anal stage involves struggles over self-control that occur during toilet training. At this stage, an issue is who decides where the young child gets to put her stuff. Children are thought to become rigid or sloppy if there are problems at this stage. The terms anal retentive and anal expressive are sometimes used to describe fixations at the anal stage. In the Oedipal stage, Freud was concerned about the triadic relations between parents, presumably opposite-sex parents, and the child. The theory is that normal development requires the child to fall in love with the opposite-sex parent, to fear reprisal from the same-sex parent, and then identify with the same-sex parent in order to establish gender identity. Freud thought that all people are born with bisexual tendencies, but heterosexuality is the normal outcome of development. He thought that over-identification with the opposite sex parent would result in homosexuality. But here he was confusing gender identity with the same or opposite sex parent and sexual orientation. Gender identity and sexual orientation are completely separate issues. The first refers to how we understand ourselves. The second refers to the people we are attracted to. The latency stage was thought to be a time when sexuality was relatively dormant, but this is actually a very active stage. Finally, at the genital stage, adult sexuality develops and development is complete, according to Sigmund Freud. Freudian scholars tell us that Freud was quite inconsistent. The Oedipal complex actually began as a theory of infanticide. Freud wrote that parents wished to be rid of their children in order to restore their lost freedom. After this theory was published, it was rejected by Freud's father, and Freud changed the theory, substituting patricide for infanticide. Similarly, Freud began to write about childhood sex abuse that many of his female patients reported to him. This idea was rejected by society, as many of these female patients were upper-class daughters of wealthy and powerful men. So Freud changed the theory to claim that these young girls wished to be sexually involved with older men. And this is where our rape fantasy comes from. In fact, these young women had been sexually abused, and Freud discovered childhood sex abuse. What do you make of Freud's article on mourning and melancholia? What is he talking about here? Well, he's distinguishing normal sadness or grief, that is mourning, from clinical depression or melancholia. This distinction is relevant today as we think of clinical depression as something different from ordinary sadness. The issues of attachment and loss are recurring themes in human development. Cathexis refers to the attachment of libidinal energy to an object, usually another person, and decathexis involves taking that energy back into the self. Freud describes depression as the result of anger turned inward. That is, after a significant loss, a person may be angry at the departed one, but the emotional energy attached to that person, love and anger, is pulled back into the self. It has nowhere else to go, so it is turned inward, or decathected, resulting in depression. For more on the distinction between normal sadness and depression, read Horwitz and Wakefield's wonderful book called The Loss of Sadness. Freud helped to develop psychoanalysis, which he called the talking cure. He didn't really think that people could be cured by this. He thought that psychoanalysis could help reduce or remove neurotic symptoms, and that it was not likely to be helpful with psychosis, although some of his colleagues thought that psychosis could be treated as well. The aim of psychoanalysis is the development of insight into unconscious conflicts and motivations. Since we don't have access to unconscious material directly, Freud and others developed techniques to get at it indirectly. These techniques include free association, analysis of slips of the tongue, dream analysis, and analysis of the transference. Each of these techniques is thought to provide clues to unconscious content. By exploring the clues, the analyst leads the patient to uncover old conflicts or unresolved issues. Once the conflict is known, the psychic energy needed to keep conflicts out of awareness is freed and the symptoms are resolved. This cannot be done by ordinary talking. So the talking cure is a bit of a misnomer. It's not ordinary talking, and it's not a cure. The transference is the client's projection of unconscious content onto the therapist. The theory is that the client reactions to the therapist mirror how the client would react to a parent of the same sex as the therapist. So if the therapist is female, the client will treat her as if she was the client's mother. If the therapist is male, the client treats the therapist as if the therapist was the client's father. By seeing what the client brings to this interaction, the therapist tries to identify unresolved issues with parents. The client's expectations of the therapist are thought to reveal her experiences with a parent. Similarly, countertransference refers to ways that therapists' expectations of the parent of patients are rooted in the therapist's own unresolved conflicts. As you read, Freud thought that his ideas, particularly about psychoanalysis, would have wide applications. He did not think their use would be restricted to the wealthy or to the worried well. He thought that psychoanalysis could be used to reduce many forms of human suffering. What do you think? So what are the strengths of Freudian theory and what are some of its limitations? Under strengths, I'd put attention to the power of psychic energy, the ideas and thoughts and feelings that affect us in many ways. Limitations include sexism. Freud thought that men were morally superior to women because, he thought, men have stronger sex drives and stronger superegos. There is a widespread acceptance of the idea that male sexuality is more potent than female sexuality, but this is probably a myth. The rape fantasy is the idea that women really wanted to be raped. That's a very dangerous idea that has taken hold in many societies, and it comes from Freudian theory. Racism is another serious limitation of this theory. Freud wrote that darker-skinned people were more, quote, bestial in nature and had stronger sex drives than Caucasian people. By his own account, given his discussion of sex differences, blacks should then be morally superior to white because people have to balance the id and superego in order to function in society. So if blacks have stronger sex drives, they must, according to his theory, have stronger superegos to balance out. But Freud made an exception to his own theory on this count, and he says that black and brown-skinned people are inferior to whites in terms of morality. This directly contradicts his sexist theory that males have stronger sex drives and stronger superegos. Heterosexism is another problem here. Although Freud thought that everyone was born with bisexual urges, he thought that proper development turned people into heterosexuals via the successful resolution of the Oedipal complex. He thought that over-identification with the opposite parent would lead to homosexuality, but here he was confusing gender identity with sexual orientation. That is, if a boy identifies with his mother and feels feminine, that's a gender issue, and sexual orientation, who he's attracted to, is something entirely different. He may be attracted to males or females or both. What are some of the uses of Freudian theory today in social work? Well, in many cases, we don't have time for the so-called talking cure. Free association is rare in psychotherapy today because it's very time-consuming. Dream analysis is a bit more common, but both of these things take time, and in most treatment settings, there isn't time for that. There is emphasis, though, in many approaches to psychotherapy on developing insight into unconscious material.